So good morning. I'm Carrie White, your Zoom host for this week's events. Welcome to the 2021 NSK Prize Keynote with Cynthia Leitich Smith. Our moderator for today's event is Daniel Simon, Assistant Director and Editor-in-Chief of World Literature Today, that is hosted at the University of Oklahoma. As we get started today, I know that some of you, this may be your first session with us for the festival, so I just want to make sure you know how to engage well with us during the session. You can definitely use the chat box, as you already are, to engage with panelists, authors, and other participants. You probably know how to take control of your own viewing options in Zoom. We are going to be sharing a screen quite a bit today, so just so that you know, you can click on view options at the top of your screen and move things around if you need to see anything bigger or smaller, you want to see more faces or not, you can totally take control of that. We are going to ask you to use the chat box as well for Q&A. If you have questions for Cynthia, we've got some time reserved today for Q&A. So would you start your questions for her with the word question in all caps? That way we know it's specifically for that Q&A time and not something that the rest of us are supposed to weigh in on and think about. It'll also help Daniel, our moderator, find those and get them to Cynthia at the end of the session. You can also use the chat box to contact me directly or Richard Feinberg, one of the co-hosts for this session, if you have any technical needs during the presentation. One of your Zoom tools is closed captioning, so you can turn this on to see a live auto transcription of the discussion if that would be helpful to you. Just a reminder that we are recording. So if you would prefer not to have your image recorded, you can turn your camera off. However, Cynthia would love to see your smiling faces, so please leave them on if you don't mind. And again, if there are several of you in a room together, that's also fun for her to be able to see who all is listening, if that's an option for you. And then finally, it is the expectation of the Neustadt family and the University of Oklahoma that all participants of the Lit Fest enjoy a welcoming and inclusive environment, free from all forms of discrimination, harassment, and retaliation. So we thank you for engaging with us in a respectful manner. And with that, I will turn things over to Daniel.
Hello, everyone, and greetings from Norman, Oklahoma, and welcome to the third and final day of the 2021 Neustadt Lit Fest. As Carrie mentioned, my name is Daniel Simon, and I have the privilege of serving as Assistant Director and Editor-in-Chief of World Literature Today, which sponsors the Neustadt Prizes here at the University of Oklahoma. I'd like to extend a special welcome to the students, teachers, and librarians from the Norman Public Schools, Colorado Academy, and from elsewhere in the state and beyond who are joining us today. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to start with a quiz. What do the names Margarita, Marilyn, Meshach, Naomi, Virginia, Vera, Catherine, Brian, and Mildred have in common? Since 2003, we have gotten to know these 9 writers on a first-name basis as winners of the NSK Neustadt Prize for Children's and Young Adult Literature. It is now my great honor and pleasure to introduce the 10th laureate of the NSK Prize and the first Native writer to be so recognized, rounding out a top 10 of outstanding writers whose works speak to readers of all ages. Cynthia Leitich Smith is with us today to deliver this year's NSK Prize keynote entitled Decolonizing Neverland, How Native Voices Are Reimagining Books for Young Readers. After giving her presentation, she has graciously agreed to answer questions from the audience. So if you do have a specific question that you would like to pose, just a reminder to submit it in the chat with question for Cynthia in all caps at the beginning, and we will do our best to answer them before the top of the hour. Many middle school students here in Norman have been reading Rain Is Not My Indian Name with their teachers the first 9 weeks of the school year and working on a curriculum packet devoted to Cynthia's novella, and I've already received questions from them to prime the pump. Cynthia Leitich Smith is the New York Times best-selling author of books for young readers, including Hearts Unbroken, which won the American Indian Library Association's Youth Literature Award. Her 2021 releases include the middle grade anthology Ancestor Approved Intertribal Stories for Kids, and a novel, Sisters of the Neversea. Cynthia is also the author-curator of Heartdrum, a Native-focused imprint at HarperCollins Children's Books, and serves as the Catherine Patterson Inaugural Endowed Chair on the faculty of the MFA program in writing for children and young adults at the Vermont College of Fine Arts. A citizen of the Muscogee Nation, she currently lives in Austin, Texas. In the nominating statement that she submitted when nominating Cynthia for the NSK Prize, Monica Brown wrote, "Cynthia Leitich Smith has made an indelible impact on the field of children's literature, both with her award-winning writing and through her advocacy and mentorship. How rare it is that a writer who has given us so many important, beautiful, entertaining, and empowering books has also given such an enormous gift to other writers, educators, and to children's literature as a whole." The January 2022 issue of WLT will include a cover feature devoted to Cynthia's life and work, including an adapted version of today's keynote. What a pleasure it is to welcome Cynthia Leitich Smith.
Thank you, Daniel. It's a huge honor to be here today. And now, if you'll indulge me for just a moment, we'll go to slide. Again, I'm Cynthia Leitich Smith, and this is Decolonizing Neverland, how Native voices are reimagining books for young readers. I am trying to advance.
Try on the slide first.
I'm sorry, what?
Yep, try clicking right there on the slide and then see if your normal way of advancing will work. By the way, everyone, we did test this just a moment ago, and of course it worked perfectly before everyone jumped on. Cynthia, let's just try stop share and share again.
All right. Not working.
Down in the bottom left of the screen, there are two arrows.
I've got it.
Okay, perfect.
Thanks so much to you all for your patience, and to my husband for rushing up to tell me exactly what I needed to do. We all need loved ones in our lives to lift us up and help us in moments of crisis. Let's all take a moment to breathe in some glittering fairy dust and share a wonderful, lovely thought. Let's contemplate the magic and power of stories and the life-changing impact of books on young readers. When I was a little girl, my parents would take me sometimes to double features at our local drive-in theater. We'd watch a children's movie together, often an animated film, and then I'd fall asleep in the back seat of the Oldsmobile while they watched a show for grown-ups. The year was 1976, the US bicentennial. Gerald Ford was the president and I was 7 years old. The double feature was one of many adaptations of James Matthew Barrie's Peter and Wendy, also known as Peter Pan, coupled with A Star is Born, featuring Chris Christopherson and Barbra Streisand. I enjoyed much of the first part of the kids' film. The darling children were highly likable. Tinkerbell won my young heart, and I never let go of that affection. I was surprised and interested to later encounter Tiger Lily, a native girl character in the story. But before long, my parents decided it was my bedtime. I curled up under a fuzzy blanket on the back seat and peeked up at the screen and worried what my friends and classmates and the neighbor kids thought of the supposed Indian characters in the first movie, and if they somehow might connect those ideas and images to me. Meanwhile, I still adored the idea of fairy dust, of flying off to adventure, of families created by birth and families forged by shared experiences. I sympathized with the young boys longing for a mother, especially one with no grandmother either, no elders at all. I wanted to befriend Tinkerbell and dearly wished that Tiger Lily and her tribe made any sort of sense. Or, in other words, I longed for a world in which the magic of story embraced all children. Much of my life's work has been about contributing to efforts to turn that longing into a reality on bookshelves. Mado, thank you for joining me today. Over the years, many of us have labored to nurture a more positive reading environment so that every young reader has a multitude of opportunities for positive connections with books. Our conversation will be largely centered on the challenges to achieving that goal, highlighting our progress, and celebrating the company we've kept along the way. With that in mind, we'll consider together why and how this is a time of hope and joy when contemplating the rise of Indigenous books for young readers. As a writer who first began her creative journey in the mid-1990s, I've had a front row seat to the expansion, contraction, elevation, and magnification of Indigenous voices and visions in books. So I'll touch on the broader landscape of youth literature, informed by my teaching in a low residency MFA in writing program at Vermont College of Fine Arts and my role as the author curator of an imprint at a major publisher. Native peoples have found it helpful to remind everyone else that we have a past, a present, and a future. We're modern peoples determined to raise up and empower today's children and teens while planning for generations to come. I'm honored to say that I write for kids and young adults, that I respect and value them as an audience. My relationship to traditional mainstream education, to books and reading, was complicated. My mother's side of the family relocated from Oklahoma to Missouri when my grandfather, a career serviceman, was transferred to Richards Gebaur Air Force Base outside of Kansas City. So that's where I spent most of my childhood, though I frequently traveled to visit relatives in Oklahoma and North Carolina, and many of my formative life lessons were gleaned from kitchen table conversations, kitchen table stories. One of my earliest memories is of my mother reminding me that I was Indian and to be proud of it, but never to talk about it at school because then the teachers and other kids wouldn't like me. She was speaking out of love. School wasn't considered a safe place, and she was afraid for me. It was a confusing message for such a young child, especially one from an adoring extended family who is drawn to learning. Fortunately, today's best educators are changing those dynamics. Fortunately, even then, there were caring teachers, and I found close friends who liked me for who I was. Years later, returning to the children's wise sections of bookstores and libraries as an adult was a revelation. We'd come several steps forward in terms of quality and inclusion, albeit in an uneven and limited sort of way. I didn't yet realize that the progress pendulum was poised to swing back. While it was still arguably what Nancy Lyric in 1965 had referred to as the, quote, all-white world of children's books, end quote, the literary conversation was experiencing a so-called multicultural boom. This translated to a bounty of picture books, many of them featuring retellings of traditional stories from cultures around the world, and middle grade novels, largely inspired by landmark historical events, movements, and tragedies, like slavery, the internment of Japanese Americans, the Trail of Tears, the Civil Rights Movement, topics touched upon in the curriculum. While every era has its excellent titles, too many of the readings were appropriated and reframed in opposition to the cultural traditions and values supposedly reflected. Likewise, too many of the novels showcased two-dimensional paper doll characters moving through the plot to play act the historical backdrop and comment on it. Though Dr. Redeem Sims Bishop's 1990 observation that children's and young adult books could serve as, quote, mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors was already influential, the oft-stated goal of multiculturalism was to use books to educate white kids about other people, especially racial and cultural minorities. Too often, depictions of the characters didn't ring true to the young readers who should have been able to recognize aspects of themselves on the page. There wasn't yet a full appreciation of what wide-ranging representation might look like, including, for that matter, ways in which some white readers and their families were underrepresented too, when it came to disability, religion, socioeconomic status, orientation, military service, body type, region, or other identity elements. After all, each of us is made up of a myriad of influences. For example, I've been influenced by my mid to Southwestern background, and it's a springboard for many of my stories. It may be especially noteworthy to those of you who, like me, are tuning in from the Central Time Zone, that in my early years in publishing, it wasn't unusual for editors to cite the fact that a story was set in the middle of the United States as a reason for rejecting it. I recall a friend sharing a decline letter from a Manhattan publisher in response to a nonfiction geology picture book manuscript. The editor enthusiastically praised the poetic writing, but explained that modern kids lived in a world of sidewalks and paved roads and didn't interact with rocks. No rocks? Thank goodness, in an ever more connected world, we're increasingly embracing fictional young heroes and real-life young readers who hail from the East Coast to West Coast to Gulf Coast, across the plains, beyond international borders, and around the globe. Yet, we could already see glimmers of what was to come. Early visionaries like Michael LaCappa and Shanta Begay, and voices like Lucy Tapahanso and Virginia Driving Hawks Neavy. While big press books were rare, native-owned presses, tribal presses, small publishers, and those based at universities were, and still are, producing some fantastic work, though unfortunately, due to financial limits and systemic blocks, those books didn't end up on enough school and library bookshelves. As an avid young reader, I didn't come across them. And even today, when I do author visits and review the host institution's collections, they're hard to find. In the late 1990s, at a bookstore in Chicago, I came across a couple of Joseph Bruchak's contemporary middle grade novels, which to me were a signal that the conversation was finally beginning to open to modern depictions that would reflect kids today. One of my favorites from that time was The Good Luck Cat by Muscogee author-poet Joy Harjo. We've all heard about the power of role modeling, but it merits noting that it can be as effective for grown-ups as it is for kids and teens. In the process of reading hundreds of children's and young adult books, I noticed a few reoccurring qualities in Native children's YA literature. First, it was almost entirely historical. The few exceptions, however meaningful, didn't rise in number to become statistically significant. I also noticed that Native characters were almost exclusively male. They avoided using contractions in speech, possessed a myriad of ghostly or mystical qualities, and resembled cliched boogeymen from Hollywood cowboy movies. Which brings us back to J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan. The non-Indian characters in his novel were kidnapped white British children, fairies, mermaids, wild beasts, and storybook pirates who apparently sailed to Neverland. And then we were given these stereotypical Old West mythology Indians, Tiger Lily and her people. As a child, they not only embarrassed me, they also baffled me. What were they doing there on that island? What tribe were they from? Why did they leave home to reestablish themselves in Neverland? Why were they acting so strangely? And why was there only one girl? You may be thinking, what difference does it make? We're talking about a children's book, a fantasy. Kids know that it's fiction, that it's all make-believe. But do they? I have navigated enough cross-cultural conversations in my life to assure you that the average American and Canadian grown-up has picked up a lot of misinformation about Native people from popular culture. So education is a factor here. But there's something else in play too that goes to the heart of story, the magic of fiction. Storybooks are miraculous, aren't they? Think about it. Symbols for words rendered in ink or pixels or illustrations can make us eager to turn the page, weep as though we've lost someone dearly beloved, reconsider our worldview, and see ourselves and each other differently, for worse and for better. However, that vicarious experience gleaned from reading only works if we first achieve suspension of disbelief. We'll clap to save a fairy's life if we care about her, because we have suspended disbelief. As far as we're concerned, at least in that moment, fairies are very much real. But if we're distracted by a disrespectful or baffling depiction on the page, that distraction can become a roadblock. preventing us from suspending disbelief and embracing the story sufficiently to engage our hearts and let our imaginations take flight. Consequently, authenticity, or put more simply, characters and worlds that ring true are key to the success of any work of fiction. Both Indigenous books written by writers like Linda Hogan, Susan Power, and Louise Erdrich, and mainstream classics by Charles Dickens, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Abraham Stoker, and William Shakespeare were among my teachers. And that's part of the reason why I often embrace juxtaposition of literary styles or hybrid forms. My debut, the picture book Jingle Dancer, illustrated by Cornelius Van Wright and Ying Wahoo, was a hybrid in a different way. It was both a storybook and a concept book. On one level, it's a narrative about this young girl bringing together her powwow regalia with the assistance of women of each generation of her family and intertribal community, and then dancing to honor them. On another, it was structured around the number 4, an important number in the Muscogee culture. 4 in terms of the number of rows of jingles on Jenna's dress, the number of directions in which she travels, the number of women she visits, and finally, in that she joins 3 other young dancers at the end of the story to become the 4th. Tink, 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 tink. Sang cone-shaped jingles, sewn to Grandma Wolf's dress. Every grandma bounced up brought clattering tinks as light blurred silver against jingles of tin. Jenna daydreamed at the kitchen table, tasting honey on fry bread, her heart beating to the brum, 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 brum of the powwow drum. As I mentioned, the author and illustrator bring much of the story, but so does the audience. It's interesting to compare, for example, feedback trends from Native and non-Indian readers. With Jingle Dancer, non-Indians in the early 2000s were often puzzled by the fact that it was a story and not merely a social studies primer. Native readers appreciated the book for the very same reason. Both remarked on the character of Cousin Elizabeth, partly because she's Black and Native, an underrepresented identity, but also because she's an attorney. And even today, professional women are rarely depicted in the pages of books for our youngest readers. Part of me wishes that choice had been more intentional, but the truth is that I was a recent 20-something law school graduate trying to brainstorm reasons why Jenna's cousin couldn't attend the powwow. And so I gave her one of mine. Cousin Elizabeth can't go because she has to work instead. Indian Shoes, an early reader chapter book, is another example of diverging reader feedback. This collection of daily life adventures about a boy and his grandfather has been called both a short story collection and a young novel. Mainstream critics of books for very young readers favor more connective or transitional tissue in individual stories. Native readers are more comfortable with loosely connected scenes. Indian Shoes has become a noteworthy contribution to children's literature because it features an urban Indian family and is one of very few books for this age market, after picture books but before middle grade novels, centered on Native characters. This glimpse into a Cherokee Seminole family is brought to life by Cherokee artist Sharon Earle's cover and Cherokee illustrator Mary Beth Timothy's interior art. A brief excerpt. Ray and Grandpa Half Moon traipsed down the cracked sidewalk of a steel and stone city. Ray tracked Grandpa's steps, danced to the rat-a-tat clang of a trash can band, and skipped beneath the ruffling branches. Again, though most Native people today reside in cities, that reality is vastly underrepresented in books. Indian Shoes is also one of my many titles that give space and respect for a main character who is an elder. Writers for grown-ups often struggle to create three-dimensional kid and teen characters. Writers who are not yet elders tend to underestimate the complexity of those who are further along life's journey. Yet, our largest generation is currently coming in at between 57 and 75 years old. Instilling an appreciation for believable, engaging elders on the page facilitates respect and empathy for them in real life, and that's ever more crucial. Readers often ask what's real and what's made up, and yes, I do know what it's like to live in the Windy City, but what's most true about this book is the bond between Ray and Grandpa Half Moon. If Jingle Dancer was my I love my grandma book, then Indian Shoes was my I love my grandpa book. To me, children's literature for elementary readers is most resonant when grounded in hope, heart, and wonder. I write both fantasy and realism, and there's a tendency to associate fantasy with its wonder, its flying kids and fairy dust, while underestimating the importance of wonder in more feet on the ground narratives. Another short excerpt from Indian Shoes. When the wind whistled into Murphy family antiques, Ray and Grandpa whistled in with it. At the welcome mat, Grandpa said morning to Junior Murphy. Ray retied his neon orange shoelaces and took a look around the store. The shop brimmed with treasures, an autographed baseball, ostrich feathers, a basket of antique buttons on a pedestal, a tabletop held up by a real elephant leg, a moose head helm mounted high on the wall. Where were the coats that matched the old buttons, Ray wondered. What happened to the rest of the elephant? Who took the body of the moose glaring down? To be a young child is to live in a perpetual state of wonder, and that's part of the magic of children's literature, no matter whether it's realistic or fantastical, and it's part of the reason half my reader mail comes from grown-ups. Last year was the 20th anniversary of my first book, Jingle Dancer, and this year is the 20th anniversary of my first novel. Rain is not my Indian name. Under any circumstances, an author would pause to reflect on her creative journey at those points, but my anniversary experience was more of a reckoning with the passage of time. I was blessed with the opportunity to revisit my first 3 books 2 decades after their original publication date, so I could update them for re-release. It was Métis artist Natasha Donovan who reinterpreted Rain Berghoff for Rain is Not My Indian Name. The story is about a Muscogee girl who is also a Cherokee and Ojibwe descendant on a grief and healing journey after the unexpected death of her best friend. When funding for her Aunt George's Native Summer Youth Program is challenged, Rain takes on a job as a part-time photographer for her small town newspaper covering the story. Then she slowly begins to emerge from her sorrow and reconnect to others through the lens of a camera. Speaking of the cover illustration, Natasha said, quote, "Fireworks are a reference to some important moments in the story, but they're also a way of representing the explosiveness of loss, both in its wild grief and its unexpected, breathless joy. This decision informed the palette as well. I knew I'd need colors that would transport readers into a slowly cooling summer night filled with the smell of smoke and the sounds of far-off revelry." End quote. While updating the text of Jingle Dancer and Indian Shoes was a matter of minor tweaks and new back matter, Rain is Not My Indian Name was a more major undertaking. When I first embarked on the manuscript in the late 1990s, it had been important that the story feel very modern, in large part because contemporary depictions of Native teens, especially Native teen girls, were so rare. Consequently, the book felt more quickly dated. The story reflected technology of the time of publication, the early 2000s. It was one of the first books to integrate building a website in the plot, and it also included then current dynamics around marginalized identity elements. A lot has changed since then. Examples include more younger Indigenous characters skewing to using the term Native, even though their elders default to Indian, capitalizing the B in Black in reference to Black people, tweaking the sensibility around gender. Society has evolved, and so has what's now considered authentic voice. The technology also got a major overhaul. Tape recorder became voice recorder, telephone lines are now power lines. Suddenly, cell phones are a factor. Finally, I took a more direct approach to communicating a few cross-cultural interactions. I brushstroked in more clarity and guidance in a scene or two where it might be illuminating. All that said, I somehow resisted the urge to delete the whole novel and start over. Hopefully, I've grown as a novelist over the past 2 decades. Revisiting my early work was a humbling process, but this exercise wasn't about the book I could write now. It was about making the book that I wrote then still resonant to kids today. So never mind that if she kept aging in real life, Cassidy Rain Berghoff would be in her 30s by now. When she reemerged in 2018 as a secondary character in an upper YA novel, she'd only aged 2 years on the page during the past 17 anyway. This is from a chapter titled Rising Rain. I was 7 and it was summer and my mom was still alive. We cruised south on Highway 169, Oklahoma bound, windows down, listening to country music, NPR, and static. Just mom and me in her 68 Mustang coupe. We pulled over at, maybe it was a Dairy Queen, for chili dogs with cheese and icy pink lemonades. Then we ran across the busy highway to this antique store with a Lucky Strike pinball machine and a jukebox playing rock and roll records for a cigar store Indian. When I crawled back into the shotgun seat of Mom's car, the vinyl seats toasted my rear end through my jeans shorts and seared the backs of my bare thighs. It was a pretty near perfect day. Between my third book, Indian Shoes, and my next book centered on Native characters, Hearts Unbroken, 12 years went by. During that time, I wrote a successful series of YA Gothic fantasy novels and a spin-off fantasy adventure trilogy. My mainstream work, though it was far more commercial, received better reviews from white critics, more awards and acclaim, and hit the Publishers Weekly and New York Times bestseller lists. Clearly, I could connect books with the marketplace, so you may be wondering, what happened with my Native representation on the page? Simply put, there was a retraction in the industry. The so-called multicultural boom had gone bust, and daily life stories of Native kids weren't considered as necessary as those that filled the slim shelf space in the social studies curriculum. Few of us were talking seriously about inclusivity as a source of literary achievement or celebration, and a single voice, usually male, in each underrepresented racial or cultural category was largely considered sufficient. I had two choices, surrender or pivot. I pivoted. I'd already tried writing what I knew, so I decided to try writing what I loved to read, what fascinated me. I've always been intrigued by how storytellers rework classics over time, and by the power of otherworldly elements to illuminate our own lives and make us care. I wrote contemporary fantasy YA novels with make-believe creatures in conversation with Abraham Stoker's Dracula, Richard Connell's The Most Dangerous Game, and Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities, among others. The mid to Southwestern, girl empowerment, intergenerational, and cross-cultural themes of my early realistic fiction thrived behind the veil of metaphor. One of my most memorable author visits took place at a juvenile detention center in Kalamazoo, Michigan. The incarcerated teens spoke of recognizing aspects of themselves and their families in the cast of fantastical heroes. They talked about what it felt like to be viewed as the frightening other. They discussed their fears and reflected deeply on whether they, like Miranda and Eternal, could be redeemed. They even speculated on God's love and the meaning of faith and whether angels were among them. Representation matters, whether it's realistic or glittering with magic. Publishing-wise, my books, they weren't quite on trend, but it was a near miss. Though I wasn't writing genre paranormal romance, the books did have monsters and romantic subplots and drew on an overlapping audience. My Native characters fell to secondary status and mostly appeared in my short fiction published in anthologies. I always intended to come back to Native literature in a bigger way. In fact, I was hopeful that maybe, just maybe, raising my profile and proving I could successfully write a wide range of titles would help secure that opportunity. Hearts Unbroken was a giant step in that direction. Along with Rain, it's among my more quasi-autobiographical works. No, neither Louise Wolfe nor Rain Berghoff is me in disguise, but I have more in common with them than any of the other characters I've ever written. They're both bicultural Muscogee teen girls from middle-class and intertribal families. The seed of each story, grief and healing in Rain, and the perils of dating while Indian in Hearts Unbroken, sprang from personal experience. My original concept for Hearts Unbroken was to showcase the world of high school journalism and to write a novel-length apology to my high school boyfriend that also integrated an examination of the various kinds of speech: interpersonal speech, political speech, religious, artistic, and journalistic speech, the types of speech that shape our society. The book asks tough questions about the artist versus the art, the speaker versus the speech. It examines the day-to-day challenges of being a Native teen in the suburbs and touches on ripple effects of history. It's a stereotype buster, reminding readers that Native teens are modern teens. Some live in predominantly tribal communities and some don't. The majority, like most of my characters, move back and forth in between. Louise Wolfe is a member of a tight-knit Native family, but she also goes to a predominantly white high school. A white girl named Shelby is her very best friend in the world, and her boyfriend is a Lebanese-American budding photojournalist. I mentioned Dr. Radine Sims Bishop's observation that books can be, quote, windows, mirrors, and sliding glass doors, end quote. Author Uma Krishnaswamy adds to this metaphor the idea of prisms. the ever colorful, ever changing glow that's created over time by intersections in the light. Intersections like a native, a Muscogee girl, with an Arab American, a Lebanese American boyfriend. Like Rain is Not My Indian Name, Indian Shoes, and my YA fantasy novels. Hearts Unbroken also features a lot of humor. So do my early picture books. Not everyone will get every joke, and that's okay. That's a high bar for anyone to get every joke. It takes time, exposure, and commitment to build a meeting of the minds sufficient to generate laughter, especially cross-culturally. Likewise, Hearts Unbroken acknowledges a cultural tradition through a brushstroke that most readers will miss, but it will be especially meaningful to those who do recognize it. Author, scholar, and activist Dr. Debbie Reese hosts a critical review and resources site with Dr. Jean Mendoza called American Indians in Children's Literature. It was Dr. Reese who added the idea of curtains to Dr. Bishop's metaphor. Essentially, the idea of curtains is that not every aspect of identity or heritage is public or free for the taking. I agree with that philosophy and strategically integrate the occasional sly wink to certain readers where it's appropriate. Writing three-dimensional characters means writing characters with flaws, and Louise has her share of them. Like a lot of teens, like a lot of human beings, she gets so caught up in her own problems that sometimes she forgets that the important people in her life need attention and support too. Fortunately, Lou's best friend Shelby eventually loses patience and calls her out on it. A brief excerpt. "Do you have any idea how spoiled you are?" Shelby asked. "How pampered and protected? You have everything and you've never had to earn a dime. And don't pretend that doing household chores for your parents or babysitting your perfect little brother or playing office with your doting older cousin counts, because it doesn't. That's fun money, spending money. You do whatever you want with it. Meanwhile, when I finally get a few minutes to spare, you're completely blowing me off, except for when you want to talk about yourself. You don't care about my life." "I care," I insisted. "I've been writing that series of stories on working students." The words sounded far weaker out loud than they had in my head. "Well then, nothing I'm saying matters." Shelby slid out of the booth. "By all means, go ahead and pat yourself on the back while this lowly peasant bows in gratitude." Her bow was more of a flourished curtsy, but she made her point. Life is not without its struggles or its heroes who rise to meet them. Speaking of heroes, while I was writing Hearts Unbroken, something remarkable happened. An up-and-coming group of incredibly talented children's YA authors and illustrators turned a hashtag into a movement and finally into a nonprofit organization called We Need Diverse Books. They expanded the focus beyond the goals of the multicultural movement that had preceded them, beyond race and culture, to be even more inclusive and to become a transformative force. One morning, Ellen O, an acclaimed author and co-founder of We Need Diverse Books, invited me to breakfast during an educator conference. I figured we'd catch up over eggs and pancakes before our first session, and we did. She mentioned in passing how wonderful it might be if there was a children's YA book imprint devoted specifically to Native voices. I agreed. What a wonderful idea. Then Ellen suggested that I'd be the perfect person to curate it. And I said, no, that job should clearly go to someone more established. A bigger name, I said. Cheerfully undeterred, Ellen pointed out that I'd been in the business for a couple of decades and had published a wide range of books across age markets, genres, and formats. She also reminded me that I'd been teaching writing for several years, which was solid preparation for nurturing new and up-and-coming voices. I promised to think about it, and that was that, except occasionally, whenever I'd hear from Ellen, she'd nudge. Months later, National Book Award finalist Debbie Dahl Edwardson invited me to teach Loon Song Turtle Island, a weekend workshop specifically for Native children's YA writers. It was a deeply inspiring experience at a rustic lakeside lodge in Cook, Minnesota. There were two moments that weekend that changed everything. The first was a question asked before the workshop began, asked by Debbie's daughter, Aluk, an Alaskan Native writer. She challenged me to do more, to improve the publishing industry, to do better, to step up and change a relatively unwelcoming landscape for underrepresented voices, for Indigenous voices in particular. You know, it's easy to say, fight the power until you realize that to a certain extent, you are the power. No, I was by no means a publishing bigwig, but I had more of a voice in the industry than a newer up-and-comer. A few days later, I was sitting out on the lodge's screened-in porch. It was a gorgeous afternoon. The lake sparkled. The manuscripts of the participating Native writers were spread out in front of me, and they were spectacular. I remembered Ellen's encouragement to launch a Native-focused imprint, looked at those stories and thought, we could do this. Together, we could all do this. After returning to Austin, I reached out to Ellen and asked if she was still interested in the imprint and the idea of We Need Diverse Books partnering with a major publisher to create a line of books by Native creatives for all young readers. Ellen said yes. I reached out to legendary children's YA book editor, my original children's book editor, Rosemary Brosnan at HarperCollins, because of her formidable skill set and because I trusted her. She said yes too. Heart Drum is now a Native-focused imprint of Harper Children's. Our debut list of 5 books has earned a combined 19 starred reviews, multiple stars for each title, for major trade publications and numerous honors. Today, Native representation is so much better than when I was a kid, more authentic, nuanced, respectful, resonant, thoughtfully rendered, funny, and even fun. For too long, there was the idea that one Native voice for kids and teens was enough. 1 star to somehow represent more than 1,000 Indigenous nations across what's currently called North America. 1 star to reflect unique cultures, languages, histories, the experiences of Black Native people and disabled Native people, and those for whom Spanish is their first language, and I could go on. Suffice it to say, we're now and forevermore a constantly expanding constellation. We'll never settle for 1 star again. Let's take a moment to bask in this awesomeness. Bask? Okay, enough basking. Ancestor Approved is a baby step toward providing a diverse and varied glimpse into the contemporary intertribal community in the United States and Canada. The stories and poems by 16 Native writers, embodied in this cover, illustrated by Navajo artist Nicole Neidhart, takes place before, during, and after the Dance for Mother Earth powwow in Ann Arbor, Michigan. What I like most about the book is that the various pieces are linked together. Characters reappear. The world building was a joint project. This undertaking was also about community off the page, introducing new voices like Cherokee Andrea Rogers to accomplish elders like Choctaw Tim Jingle. The contributors collaborated via an online message board, emails, text messages, phone calls, every 21st century means of communication at our disposal. With that in mind, I'd like to read a very brief excerpt from a poem in the collection by debut Wichita writer Kim Rogers, who hails from Oklahoma. She currently has 3 picture books under contract with Heart Drum. Kim wrote, "A powwow is prizes and recognition, but community is the best prize of all. We began this conversation by breathing in fairy dust, and since then have traveled well past the 2nd star. And so now it seems only fitting that we conclude with a brief peek into my latest novel, Sisters of the Neversea, with cover art by Floyd Cooper. It's fair to say that my subconscious has been rewriting J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan since I was that little girl in the backseat of my parents' Oldsmobile, pretending to be asleep. The heart of my story is a love between the co-protagonists, Lily Roberts and Wendy Darling, who are stepsisters and best friends living in suburban Tulsa. Probably the best response I've received so far was from an Indian teacher who told me how happy she was to finally have a Peter Pan story she felt good about sharing with her students and grandchildren. In the following excerpt, all you need to know is that Wendy and Michael Darling have flown off to Neverland with Peter and Belle. Their stepsister Lily kept her feet on the ground, but now feels compelled to follow her beloved siblings and bring them home. "What should I do?" Lily asked the shadow. It pointed to its head, and she whispered, "Think." It drew a smile across its blank face, and she guessed, "Happy?" Lily remembered Wendy beckoning her, instructing her to think a lovely, wonderful thought. Could that really do the trick? Lily closed her eyes and focused on joyful family memories. On the rainy Chicago day, when Mr. Darling and Ms. Roberts Darling exchanged wedding vows at City Hall. On the way John proudly held up his diploma, Lily was rising, floating, flying. Lily felt the shadow grip her hand. She felt herself drawn forward. On fearful reflex, she gripped the window frame. She took a breath, focused again. She recalled the bright Tulsa morning when Michael was born. She remembered Wendy's voice reading Ella Enchanted. Wendy needed her, Michael too. Lily flew through the open window and up, 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 up. Lily opened her eyes, took a trembling breath of the night, looked to the right. Hello, stars, she said. Here's to a more inclusive, engaging, and respectful reimagining of children's and teen literature, wherein any young character can be a hero that everyone cheers, where we find diverse representation, defined broadly in the bylines and structures and worldviews that frame the stories themselves. Yes, there is still much work to be done. But it's fair to say that if we can decolonize Neverland, we can do anything. Mado, thank you for your kind attention and for this wonderful honor. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. That was so inspirational. The expanding constellations, I think, are inspiring all of us to reimagine how we ourselves encountered children's literature and young adult, and now how we might continue to appreciate the constellations that are out there that we've never seen before, perhaps. I actually have a quick question to kind of kick us off, and it takes up something you said to Heather Schotten last night in response to her question, what do you hope for Indigenous youth? And I was so moved by what you were saying about fostering empowerment, being part of a chorus and inheriting a long tradition of storytelling. And my follow-up question then is, who helped you find your voice as a writer? Was it vicariously through your reading, or was there a specific person or persons or community of writers that helped you to do that? And I know you've mentioned so many incredible predecessors in your presentation this morning, but I thought I might just ask you, who helped you find your voice as a writer?
Part of it was reading. Certainly, I was an avid reader from the time I was a young girl, and I read broadly. When I first dedicated my life's work to writing for young readers, I was blessed by the opportunity to study with Newbery Honor author and two-time National Book Award finalist Kathy Appelt at her family's ranch in LaGrange, Texas. And it was Kathy who really in some ways gave me permission to let my voice free. She was loving and encouraging, much like a bossy big sister, in all of the right ways. She pushed when I needed it, and she showed faith that never faltered, even in those years when I myself was struggling. Beyond that, as the storytelling circle has widened, I've had the opportunity for the encouraging word or moment of guidance from folks like Tim Tingle, who I mentioned earlier. He's based here, likewise in Texas. And for many, many years, when I would go to conferences, there might be 300, 500 children's young adult authors, but we would be the only two Native people. And there was this lovely moment of connection and opportunity to discuss in a bit of a bubble what we were trying to do, what the obstacles were to it, and the importance of continuing forward, whatever that would mean for us, given the current landscape at the time.
Thank you so much. I have these questions from the Norman Public Schools middle school students who have been reading Rain is Not My Indian Name this first quarter. And I thought we could start off by having a few of these questions, and then we'll get to some in the chat as well. So one that really struck me, and I'm sorry I don't know the names of the students who posed these questions, but she or he wrote, do you believe that color hides the truth? Is rain a reflection of yourself or someone close to you?
There's more of me in Rain and Louise from Hearts Unbroken than any of my other characters. At the same time, once they get their footing on the page, they do take on lives of their own. It's intriguing. Both of those books feature a Native character who is more light-skinned. And so that impacts the way they move through the world. They have opportunities that some of their siblings and cousins might not. At this moment, I'm shifting gears and working on a book that is centered on Huey. on Louise's younger brother, who looks more stereotypically, if you will, Native. And the impact of that is significant on his experience. So there is a heightened awareness of the diversity within Indian country, how that affects our children, and also how they can bridge those perhaps perceived separations between them.
This is another question from a student. Goes, which parts of the book were most difficult to write for you?
Most difficult parts of
Rain?
Rain?
Yeah.
Of Rain. I would say the framing of Galen's passing was very challenging. The book was inspired by a real life incident when I was a sophomore in high school. And so I had a heightened appreciation of the fact that young readers encountering the story might be processing loss or grief of their own. I wanted to be respectful to them and their feelings. I wanted to offer healing without reopening those wounds. So I navigated that with a great deal of love and care, but also what I thought was honesty. One of the qualities that I found identifiable about Rain is that she doesn't necessarily want to respond the way she's expected to this tragedy by her small town community. She is supposed to wear the right dress. She's supposed to say the right words. She is supposed to be this living embodiment of what his best friend stand-in would be at that moment. And she doesn't want any of it. She is in her own place of pain and sorrow and is making every effort to define it on her own terms. And with regard to, 20 years of correspondence from young readers, the people that I work for, many of them have told me that they really identified with that aspect, that especially those who had encountered loss of their own, they felt burdened by society's expectations of grief at a time when they were already struggling due to the loss itself.
I love how the back of the new book cover includes the motif of the swing set on it, and how that's such an important metaphor for the book, for the protagonist. The next question is, would you write about Queenies heritage any differently today than you did back then?
I would have been more clear. Queenie is a Black Seminole girl. She has not been raised with a heightened awareness of the Indigenous aspect of her identity. And so she's doing what we recommend. Her family, her auntie, is doing research, is looking into their ties, and Queenie is pursuing thoughtful education. She is reaching out to reconnect. She's doing the work to reconnect to the extent that she can in the small town community with other kids in this intertribal program. And it's a place of newness to her, aspect of her identity that she's just navigating. The girls themselves, Rain and Queen, and she's Queen in future books as she grows older and drops a bit of her younger nickname, are very, very close friends. Essentially what's happened is that they both liked a boy to a certain extent, Rain more than Queenie. And they had a little bit of a rivalry over that. They had been best friends for a long time. Suddenly they're coming of age. Romance is a new dynamic in their lives and relationships. And if Galen hadn't died, in my opinion, it wouldn't have been that big of a deal. They would have gone on, they would have had coming of age sort of teen experience where they sorted through what it was like to have romantic feelings for the first time, what it was like to feel jealousy or rivalry in a new playing field, and life would have gone on and it would have healed quickly. Because he dies and Rain withdraws so profoundly in her grief, that conversation, that healing moment doesn't happen. It freezes them in time until the very end of the book. In future stories, they have reconnected and reunited. So there is a certain amount of tension in that. I also wanted to unpack some of the, I think, bias within Indian country. There is anti-Black bias that needed to be addressed and healed in a way that felt authentic to a 14-year-old's perspective and one who was in a difficult moment in her life. She is in a place of raw emotion. She's not processing like she should. And so when I was revisiting the book, I added more connective tissue to make the love between the girls more clear, what they were going through more clear, and to show that this was a rift that would be healed over time. When I first started writing, there was this idea that we should always trust young readers to know what was right, that they could read between the lines, that we should be very careful not to teach or preach, and perhaps we went too far in that. And I deferred more than I would have at this point in my career, with more confidence in terms of my own vision for the books and what they should contain. And I do believe that a certain amount of teaching, not in a heavy-handed or condescended way, but with full respect to the audience, is appropriate in all storytelling. We originally told stories to teach. So why would we shun that now? So I've added a little bit more connective tissue and explanation to make clear the need for Rain and Queenie to have a heightened understanding of each other, but really putting the burden on Rain to stretch herself and grow to a better place. Queenie is much more emotionally healthy than Rain is throughout the book. She has grieved Galen, but she isn't stuck in the way that Rain is, cycling. So it's only when they begin to move together that Rain's healing really begins.
Wow, what an amazing answer. That's incredible. You just obviously think so deeply about your characters' relationships and how readers will respond to them. I have one last question from a student from the Norman Public Schools, and she writes, what would you be if you weren't a writer?
I went to journalism school and law school, and I enjoyed both. If you think about it, though, they're both professions that are rooted in story. In journalism, you're telling true stories about what's happening in a community. In law, essentially, the respective attorneys are telling competing stories, competing viewpoints of the same story to convince a judge or jury that their version is more resonant, is more truthful, and should be honored. So I feel like all of those are kind of wrapped up in terms of my past and the skills I learned to get me to this point. I suspect that I would be a full-time educator. I teach now. I teach writing in the MFA program and writing for children. And for me, I learned so incredibly much from my colleagues and from the students themselves. If you open the back of Sisters of the Never Sea, you'll see that 2 of our students are thanked, actually 3, because they did jointly, for their graduate lectures, which I listened to while I was writing the book. And I learned from them some of the craft and heart considerations that I really needed to take into consideration in moving forward and framing the story.
That's great. We're close to the top of the hour. Do you have a few more minutes to answer questions, Cynthia?
Sure.
Okay, that's one of the lovely things about Zoom is if folks have to leave, we'll let them depart. But I wanted to get to some of the questions in the chat, which has had this incredible, lively conversation going on. And so this is maybe a bit of a lightning round of questions, but I wanted to give you a chance to respond to these. Dawn St. Clair writes, I teach college freshmen in U.S. history, and I very much want to represent the many instances of Indigenous culture in the most appropriate way. Do you have any suggestions for introducing students to accurate Indigenous cultures in the most accurate fashion, particularly in regard to those tribes in Oklahoma? Thank you.
You know, regardless of the age of students, I recommend beginning with picture books. I don't think that there is ever an age that we are too old to appreciate picture books, and they're exquisitely written. The art is engaging, and it can provide an overview. There are numerous suggestions on my website on American Indians and Children's Literature. Look for books by Native people writing about their lived experience or those experiences of their tribal nation. And while there isn't a book for every topic that you'll want to explore, there are many books out there that can be used for more than one and integrated throughout the academic year. One of the things that we too often see is an exclusive celebration of Native voices during Native Heritage Month or Indigenous Peoples Day. And we like a celebration, don't get me wrong, but we're Indigenous 365 days of the year and have been making history, impacting the present and future all along. So let's, open our hearts, minds, and classroom conversations to fully embrace that.
That's fantastic. Yeah, this next question is probably more of a historical question from Michael Snyder. He writes, you have studied journalism and written about a Native student journalist in Hearts Unbroken. As a Muscogee writer, is Alexander Posey in the background of what you do?
I am aware of Alexander Posey's work, of course, and I even considered at one point perhaps trying to write a picture book biography about him because I don't believe he's as well known to young readers. But one of the things that I always make a point of emphasizing is that, yes, we do have a rich oral storytelling tradition. There is that is often associated with Native peoples, but there is a literary tradition too. And it's important to keep in mind that the first Native writers are not those writing today. They are still inheriting from previous generations the works, unique literary styles that speak to our worldviews and priorities.
And the humor of Posey and other writers, I think that comes through in your work and elsewhere as well, and such a wonderful continuity in that tradition. Well, I think we put in the chat a couple of links. One is to the Education Network resources, which are curricula for your books and other NSK laureates books going back to 2013 when Naomi Shiab-Nye was the winner. So I encourage teachers to check those out. There's also a PDF from Monday's panel on celebrating diversity in YA Lit that is including resources for teachers and others who are interested in learning more. I don't know that there are any more questions in the chat that we'll answer for now, but I think that probably wraps up our time together. Let me just quickly thank some of our, especially our audience, of course, and the librarians and teachers who work on the front lines of inspiration and enlightenment. Thank you to our principal sponsors, the Neustadt family, including Kathy and Nancy, who are here with us this morning, the Norman Arts Council, and OU's College of International Studies in particular. We hope to see you at 7 p.m. Central Time this evening for the formal award ceremony where Cynthia will receive the 2021 NSK Prize for Children's and Young Adult Literature. Carrie, I'll let you send us off. Thank you.
Thanks everyone for joining us today. It's been a great conversation. Thanks again to Daniel and Cynthia. We'll see you this evening.